This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Best-selling author and Harvard University professor, Dr. Robert Putnam, on this edition of Conversations. Dr. Robert Putnam has written over 24 books, including Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. His most recent book is entitled Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, which addresses the growing educational and economic gap in America. Putnam's counsel and expertise has been solicited by Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, as well as several European leaders. In addition to writing books and speaking around the world, Dr. Putnam is a professor of public policy at Harvard University. We're glad to have Robert Putnam on this edition of Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Jeff, it's good to be with you.
It's a real pleasure. Tell me about the book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis.
Well, over the last 30 or 40 years, America's undergone some big changes. We're more economically divided than we used to be. We're more segregated in economic terms than we used to be. Rich folks and poor folks living in different parts of town, more than used to be the case. The family structure has changed a lot, become weaker, especially in what we used to call the working class. And so I wanted to know, well, what difference does this make for kids? Well, how are kids doing? And how about the difference between kids coming from the upper part of the society, kids coming from college-educated homes? If you're in America nowadays, Jeff, and you have a college degree, that automatically puts you in the upper third of the American society, and you can compare kids coming from college-educated homes with kids coming from high school-educated homes. That's basically the bottom third of the society and of the economy. And didn't used to be. There were huge gaps between kids coming from, middle-class homes or upper-middle-class homes and working-class homes. When I grew up in the 1950s, there was not much of a big gap between what you might call rich kids and poor kids. But now, what we learned in the course of doing this work is the gap has grown enormously. And the book has a whole bunch of graphs that look like this. We call them scissors graphs, which show kids coming from affluent homes. I'm not talking about Bill Gates. I'm talking about people coming from college-educated homes, my grandchildren. Okay. Kids like that, or your kids doing better and better, actually. But then kids coming from what we used to call the working class, on the same measures, doing worse and worse. And you can see that, and this is where the book begins, even in my hometown. Right. I grew up in a tiny little town in the Midwest, and when I was growing up, there was not that much difference between kids from the right side or the wrong side of the tracks. All of us have done pretty well. And yet now, if you go back to Port Clinton, Ohio, and look at the two sides of town, as I say, the right side of tracks and the wrong side of tracks, those kids are living in different universes, actually.
What's driving this?
Well, it's a variety of things. It's partly the gap in income, because people from affluent homes have gotten more and more affluent, and they can afford more and more things for their kids. More weeks at summer camp, more computer games, more trips to Paris, and so on. And people at the other side of the gap, it's well known now that people down in the working class in America have not really had a raise for the last 30 or 40 years. So part of it is just that economic difference. Part of it is that we're increasingly segregated, I mean geographically segregated, into what you might have called the good parts of town and the bad parts of town, but it's not on racial grounds. We're actually less segregated racially than we used to be, but we're more segregated in terms of economics and education. So affluent folks living on one side of town, and their kids go to good schools, and they hang out with other privileged kids, and working class kids of whatever race. This is not about race. Working class kids are increasingly concentrated in poor schools, more dangerous neighborhoods. Their families are actually kind of fragile. Most of the kids on this side of town have only one parent at home, almost always a single mom. Almost all the kids on this side of town have two parents. And it's not that single moms can't raise kids. We all know single moms who are doing a bang-up job of raising their kids. It's just easier if you've got two parents than if you've only got one parent. So all of these advantages, the quality of schools, even whether kids are connected with their neighbors. These kids over on this side of town are surrounded by peers and other adults, clergymen and clergy people and neighbors and so on who are looking out for them, and these kids are utterly isolated. Their families are weak and fractured. They can't trust even their own family, they tell us. We interviewed lots and lots of these kids on both sides of town. They can't trust their neighbors because they're living increasingly in dangerous neighborhoods. They can't trust their teachers because they're increasingly concentrated in bad schools. Increasingly, these kids over here are taking part in, football and band and chorus and so on, and these kids are increasingly not taking part in extracurricular activities. So these kids have coaches that are looking out for them, and these kids don't. And that fundamentally is the core part of the story, that we as a country have not paid attention to what's happened to these kids on this side of town. The reason that the book has the title Our Kids is that when I was growing up in the 1950s in a small town in the Midwest, and my parents or other adults talked about doing things for our kids. They said, our kids need a swimming pool. We ought to save up and build a swimming pool for our kids. And they were not talking about my sister and me. They were talking about all the kids in town. And they weren't talking about a swimming pool in our backyard. They were talking about a pool that all the kids in town could use. They meant, by the term our kids, they meant all the kids in town. But now, if you listen carefully, over the last 30 or 40 years, the meaning of our kids has shriveled. So now when people talk about our kids are doing pretty well, they mean their own biological kids. And that shriveling of a sense of connection and responsibility to all the kids in town, that's the underlying cause.
What do you think has caused that disconnect?
Yeah, I wish I knew for sure. It's a variety of things. The country has been on a long, I would say, individualistic focus, bender almost, over the last 30 or 40 years. And this is not about left-wing politics or right-wing politics. You can see this same individual focus, what some people call the me era. You can see that on the left and on the right. And that pendulum, which is, America, has always had both an individualistic emphasis and also a communitarian emphasis. People think sometimes that the right image of America is the lone cowboy riding across the plain opening the West, but that's actually not how we opened the West. It was wagon trains. Right. And by wagon trains, people got together and helped one another to make it across the country. And I think we happen to be in a period in which this pendulum is swung from a we, us kind of America, in which we all care for one another. I don't mean we're all identical, of course not, but that we all kind of have a sense of our obligations to one another. We've swung way to the other end of that spectrum, and I think it's time we get about thinking about other people.
And doing some research on you indicated this is not the first time this has happened in this country. Is
that
correct? That's
right. And that's a really crucial part of understanding both how we got here and what we can do about it. And this is why fundamentally I'm optimistic that we can fix the problem. America, a little more than 100 years ago, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, say around 1900, also had a big gap between rich and poor, a huge gap. It was called the Gilded Age. So we had the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and all these rich folks, and also you had a lot of really poor immigrants. They weren't immigrants from Mexico, they were from Italy or from Ireland or from Poland or whatever. So we had a big gap between rich and poor. We had a sense of political corruption, a sense that none of the major political parties were really attending to our problems. I don't know if that sounds familiar or not. A sense that we'd gotten as a society into kind of a dead end. And especially that we weren't caring for all the kids in America, as we once had in the earlier part of the 19th century. And then, very quickly, surprisingly quickly, Americans recognized the problem and began to do something about it. We recognized the problem partly. There was a book written in that era, around 1890, called How the Other Half Lives. And it was a book that was designed to, it was a book written about the tenement slums of the Lower East Side of New York, meant to be read in the silk stocking districts of the Upper East Side of New York. And the author, a Danish-American journalist, was saying essentially to the rich folks in Manhattan, look, this is what's happening not more than 10 miles away from you. Are you happy with that? Mm. And of course, some of the people said, sure, it's not my problem, let them worry about it. But some people said, no, you know, they're also Americans. We've got to worry about them too. And then that led to a breakthrough in a lot of things people actually began doing. I don't want to go on too long about that period, although I think it's a very inspiring period. But the one interesting thing that happened then is that Americans in 1910, in order to come to grips with the fact that there were a lot of kids who didn't have the same opportunities as rich kids, Americans invented the high school. The high school was not invented by God, or if it was, this is how he did it. And it didn't begin in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New York, or Los Angeles. It began in small towns in the middle of America, in Kansas and Iowa, and then spread out from there. People said in these small little towns, every kid here ought to have, just because they're a kid, ought to have 4 free years of secondary education. I mean, that sounds, well, of course they must. You must now think, well, of course everybody had that, but that's not true. Until then, the only people who could get 4 years of secondary education were people whose parents paid for them. Mm. And the reformers had to go to the local rich banker or the local rich farmer or the lawyer who had already paid for their kids to get a secondary education. And their kids now are off in Chicago or, LA making money. You had to say to them, you should pay a little bit higher taxes so that other kids from the wrong side of the tracks, can have the same advantage. It was not an easy sell. I'm sure. But it turned out to be the best public policy decision Americans have ever made. And why was it? It was because it did 2 things at once that economists tell us you can't do. On the one hand, giving everybody in America 4 years of high school education, free, so raised the level of productivity of the American workforce that it doubled the American growth rate. So everybody was better off. The rich folks and the poor folks and the rich kids often, everybody was boosted up by this enormous jolt of productivity that came from that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time it leveled the playing field. So that it didn't matter what your parents did, you could go as far as your own native talents and hard work justified. The American dream is not that everybody ends up the same place. The American dream is that how well you do in life should depend upon you and your hard work and your skills and God-given talents, but shouldn't depend upon what your parents did or didn't do. That's what we've always held as. If we're successful in America, it's because of what we did, not because of what somebody else did, our parents or our grandparents. And that's been more true in America than in other countries historically, but it's less true now in America than it used to be. That's the problem that I'm talking about here. And I think we can fix this once again. Now, it's not a matter of inventing the high school. We've done that. It's a matter of finding the 21st century equivalent of that innovation.
What do you think that might be?
Well, my research team has brought together 50 of the best experts in America on the question of how to narrow this opportunity gap. And we produced a report called Closing the Opportunity Gap. Your viewers could go online to theopportunitygap.com and find this report. And it lists 75 different good ideas that have been shown to work. So I'm now going to be drawing on those other people's ideas. I think the most important would be early childhood education, free, high-quality early childhood education. By early childhood education, I mean beginning very young, 1 or 2 up to kindergarten. We know there's very good research that pays for itself, because poor kids without early childhood education begin school, enter K-12 school a year or 2 years behind kids from the other side of the tracks. And that's wasting the talents of these kids. The rest of us can't afford to waste the talents of these kids just because they are coming from the wrong side of the tracks. And the evidence is quite clear that what business people call the return on investment from investing in high-quality early childhood education is very high. It's a no-brainer, honestly. And it's expensive, but it has a very high payback. Just as, a businessman would say, well, I got to make a big investment. I mean, I probably can make a lot of money if I make a big investment here, because I'll get a big return. And this is an ideal investment, early childhood education. We need to think about other things like the opportunities for kids to get in extracurricular activities. I mean, there's another gap like that, extracurricular activities. Kids from that side of town are taking part more and more in extracurricular activities. Kids from this side of town are just much less than they used to take part, much less likely than they used to take part in band or chorus or football or French club or debate or whatever. And we know those skills, those activities, teach kids soft skills. They teach them grit, what my mom used to call stick-to-itiveness,
Right.
and teamwork. And those are skills that the kids from this side of town are getting still because they're taking part in those activities, but because across the country we've instituted what's called pay to play. That is, if your kid wants to play football, say, or basketball or soccer or whatever, nowadays their parents have to pay.
Yeah.
And of course what that's meant is the kids from this side of town aren't taking part. So there are things we need to do even at that level, at the level of local school policy. There are things that all of us need to do, like providing mentorship. It used to be, one way to think about it is all kids do dumb things.
Sure.
Kids, black kids, white kids, rich kids, poor kids, maybe even kids in Pensacola do dumb things. They get in a fight with a teacher, or they drink too much, or they get involved with drugs or whatever. But when kids on this side of town do some dumb thing, they instantly, from their family and friends and their parents' friends and their teachers and their coaches and their clergymen and so on, instantly airbags inflate to protect the kid from the worst consequences of that dumb decision. So if one of my grandchildren, God forbid, we should discover is involved in drugs, the first thing I do is find the best lawyer in town. And the second thing I do is to find the best rehab facility in town. And I don't apologize for that. That's what loving parents or grandparents do.
Sure.
But when a kid from this side of the town does exactly the same dumb thing, no airbags.
Right.
No people around them. Because these kids over here are surrounded by, and that's great, loving parents and neighbors and so on. And these kids are increasingly isolated. And what that means is a lot of us on this side of town could be doing more mentoring for kids on this side of town. And by mentoring, I don't mean just saying, once a year showing up and having lunch and saying, how's your life, kid?
Right.
That's not what we do with our own kids. What we do with our own kids is help them progress, and that's what we need to do. In an earlier America, that's what we did. We did worry about other people's kids too, not just our own. Yes. So there's plenty of opportunity for nonprofits and private sector organizations to help with the problem.
Because as some of your research has indicated, it gets to be a very, very expensive problem if this continues to escalate, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the cost to the rest of us in terms of taxes and so on, the cost of not investing in these poor kids over the course of their lifetime, today's generation of poor kids, over the course of their lifetime, the cost of the rest of us is going to be about $5 trillion, trillion with a T. We're talking really big bucks here. And why is that? Well, the first thing people are likely to think of, if this is true, is we're going to have to pay a lot more for the criminal justice system. Because these kids over here, if we ignore them, continue to ignore them, they're going to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. I repeat, this is not about race. It's about the kids, black kids, white kids, brown kids, all sorts of kids who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. Some of them are going to get in trouble, and the rest of us are going to have to pay for cops and prison guards and so on. That's the first thing. That's not the biggest thing. Even bigger is those kids are going to get sick earlier, longer, worse. There's relatively little obesity on this side of town. Rich kids are actually, the obesity epidemic among affluent Americans is declining, whereas the obesity epidemic among kids on this side of town is exploding. What does that mean? That means they're going to get diabetes and heart disease much earlier. And who's going to cover the bill? Somebody's going to cover the bill. We're not going to have them dying in the streets. So that's a larger part of the $5 trillion. So part of it is criminal justice, part of it is health care costs. But the biggest part of it is we're losing. We can't afford to throw away this talent. There are really smart kids, of the highest performing in test scores, the smartest kids in America, whose parents who were coming from low-income families, of them only 29% are going to get a college degree. So think what that means. That means 71% of the smartest American kids are not going to get a college degree, not because their parents can't afford it, not because they couldn't hack it, but because their whole lives up to that point, they've been given the short end of the stick. And we're going to pay for that, right? I mean, some of the strongest advocates that I've encountered as I go across the country, some of the strongest advocates for early childhood education, doing other things for these kids, are business people who are looking ahead and saying, where are my workers going to come from? All these baby boomers are going to retire. Who's going to replace them? And if we are throwing away nearly 3/4 of the smartest kids in America, not because they're not good, but because they chose the wrong parents. Right. It's not fair, but it's also economically dumb.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very valid point. I talk to a lot of people in the business world, and one of the biggest things that I get from folks is I can't find people.
Right.
I can't find good people.
Sure.
And I have often believed that a lot of our unemployment issues right now are structural versus economic.
Right.
And what I mean by that is jobs that are being taken over by robots or by automation or something. So how do we address that?
Well, there is a problem about automation, but there's still going to be plenty. The problems of the future, I think, are not going to be that we don't have adequate jobs it's that we don't have adequately trained kids for the jobs that are the new jobs, the frontier jobs, the jobs that are rising in importance. And it's not just, some of those jobs are going to be rising blue collar jobs or working class jobs. I'm not going to be able to, if you know a good plumber, let me know.
Right. Those aren't going away.
We're not going to outsource that to China.
Right.
But in addition, all of the skills that are locked up on this side of town could be helping all of us. And I mean, even in high-tech things, because there's plenty of smart kids over there.
Absolutely.
It just isn't economically sensible, and it's certainly not fair that some kids do better than others because of who their choice of parents was.
Yeah. Which is something they have absolutely no control over,
right.
Obviously. So I've got a little less than 4 minutes right now. So what would be your solution for a community? What could a community do to start making these changes?
Well, look, I actually do think that the solution to this problem, when it comes, and I'm optimistic it will come, will come from the grassroots across America. That's the way America has historically solved problems, because who knows, our national politics, you know better than I do, our national politics now is unbelievably screwed up. It's incredibly polarized, and people are just not listening to each other, and they're not able to hear one another. But when you get down to the level of the grassroots, and you say to people, in Pensacola, or in Toledo, or in, Boston, or in
Nashville, wherever.
Asheville, whatever.
Yeah.
You say, look, we've got kids right here in Pensacola. I don't know Pensacola very well, but I'm willing to bet you that there are kids in the Pensacola metropolitan area who reflect this problem that I've talked about. And you can you get around the table and say, so okay, what can we do here? And that's what this booklet that I described, Narrowing the Opportunity Gap, is full of really practical things that have been proven, not just academic ideas, but have been proven to work. Early child education, family parenting, apprenticeships, community colleges, things that churches can do, and there are a lot of things. And the way the problem is going to get fixed nationally is by having a grassroots movement saying, well, I don't know about Washington, but we've begun to fix the problem here in Pensacola. And if you get a good idea, if folks in Pensacola got a good idea for fixing this, I guarantee you that idea would go national.
Yeah. Closing the Opportunity Gap is the name of the report, and
yes.
Folks can go online and download that. Is that correct?
And Our Kids lays out what the problem is and where it came to. So this is the first part, and then the Closing the Opportunity Gap is the place to go if you want to fix it.
Yeah, interesting. The name of the book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, as Dr. Putnam said, kind of describes the problem of what's going on. And I had an opportunity to scroll through the report some this week, and yeah, interesting facts, and certainly for thought leaders and for political leaders and business leaders, it's worth spending a little bit of time of going through that report. Some great ideas.
Well, thank you. One of the things that we enjoyed in writing the book was we have a lot of stories. As you know, there's a lot of stories in there, not just academic stuff, but stories about real kids trying to surmount these problems.
Any more books coming down the line?
Yeah, I'm working on, up in the woods in New Hampshire, I'm working on a new book trying to give a little bit broader picture of how we got here. That's the next book.
Wonderful. What a pleasure talking with you.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much. Wish you all the best of luck.
Thanks.
The name of the book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. Robert D. Putnam is the author. He's authored over 24 books, so I would encourage you to spend a little time and maybe take a look at his website, Robert Putnam, at robertdputnam.com. You can learn a lot about what Dr. Putnam has going on. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations. We're also on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by Gulf Power, a Southern company, and by viewers like you. Thank you.